today I'll be so Vivek gave a great framework, right, for selecting the sensor. So I thought, can you guys hear me well? Yeah? So I thought I'd take this opportunity to give you a little bit of my experience in terms of the sensor selection process, the sensor design and development process, and go at it from there. I did put up my acknowledgements in the beginning, so I would like to acknowledge my students. It does take a village, my mentors, a lot of my collaborators as well, and my funding resources as well, and funding agencies. So I'm going to start with my story just to give a little bit of background in terms of how I actually got here. So I actually studied at UCLA, so this is sort of grew up in LA, and who would have thought that this used to be a lot 6. I used to park my car here. 19 or maybe 18 years ago. So who would have thought that I'd actually be presenting in the parking lot? Exactly. So I got my bachelor's of science in CS and a minor in sociology here in 2003. I then went and I worked for a defense contractor for about 8 years where we did research, and I developed a lot of interest in research there as well, right? And also some expertise in grant writing, especially in the SBIR, SBTR role. But here we looked a lot at video tracking and image-based processing. I then went back to UCLA. Actually, during these 8 years, I also got a master's in AI and robotics, and then had interest in doing my Ph.D. in CS, but more in line with wireless and mobile health. And then I ended up moving to Northwestern, and this is where I built the Habits Lab. And what's interesting about our lab, take the village, so here are my students, is we're sort of housed right here. We have this little home in medicine, right? And so the goal of our lab is really to begin to bridge between engineering and computer science. So between computer science, engineering, and medicine. So just, I'd like to poll, how many of you guys here have used some sort of mHealth or sensor in your setting? Or how many of you have not had any problems with it? All right. That's what I thought. So I'm approached a lot of times from collaborators, researchers that have sort of a research study. And then, and they recently saw this sensor that was published, with all this potential. Maybe an NIH program officer told them, this is a great technology or a great device, and so you should use it. And when they come and talk to me sort of before the study launches, I'm happy, but oftentimes they come to me once the study is sort of over, and this is their condition, right? And so they're extremely frustrated. And so I thought what I'd start here by doing, so they come often and ask me, what are the right questions to ask our engineers or collaborators, right, in computer science also about the sensor. And so I thought I'd take this opportunity to also, as I talk about my experience with some of these sensors, to also provide some sort of guidance in terms of what are the right questions to begin to ask when trying to decide about these devices, using also Vivek's framework as well. So I like to think about it this way when it comes to our societal impact, right, in research, right? So a lot of times, what we're trying to do is we're trying to detect a certain construct, right, to ultimately improve our understanding or our definition of that sort of complex construct, and then ultimately potentially predict it to prevent it, right, to have sort of a public health impact. And sometimes, we might bypass the prediction phase and go to understand directly to prevention. And then, again, once we're trying to prevent, hopefully we then improve our understanding and there's this. Now, I argue that we're still sort of in this world here, right? We're spending a lot of time really understanding how to improve our ability to detect certain constructs and also improve our understanding in order to begin to design smarter, better interventions. All right, and so how do I operationalize the measure, right? And so again, we have this complex construct, an example related to eating or stress. Again, we want to select our population of interest. Now, when we're operationalizing, we tend to, we're used to sort of these legacy measures of self-report, right? They're easy to collect. We believe it a little bit more potentially, but again, they come with this sort of high burden and high recall bias. And so now there's this nice, beautiful technology, right, that's going to solve all our problems, and again, it's automated, it's potentially more accurate, and also it has the potential to sort of redefine how we measure these constructs, right, and how we understand human behavior in general. But again, there's things that Vivek also mentioned, and others as well, like Donna and Bonnie earlier today, that there is a sort of wearer burden, and again, it is prone to tech failure. We also need to begin thinking about how we combine self-report and sensor data so they begin to really complement each other, right? A lot of times when we talk about this, we're thinking of this more as either using self-report or sensors. We need to start thinking about how they benefit, right? Or how we benefit by combining these two sources. I'll be focusing a lot again here on the sensor in my talk. So here's this great framework that Vivek showed us earlier, and what I'm going to focus on really is the first three components here, right? So how do we go about selecting our sensor, talking about a lot of the technical performance and human factors, right? And again, there's a lot of iteration here, right? You try to assess the technical aspects of the sensor. There are human factors that you're constantly thinking about, and again, looping back into the selection process. I'll touch on a few of these, but again, I'll be focusing in here. And so in my experience, what I a lot of the constructs that I'll be talking about relate to eating, and the population is mainly focused surrounding participants with obesity. But I also look at how do we measure stress, right? In particular, as it relates to pregnant women. And there's also another construct that I look at is also UV exposure and time outdoors as it relates to melanoma survivors. I'll focus mainly on eating and obesity and touch on, depending on how much time we have, touch on these other projects as well. So again, I always, when we're talking about eating, I have to keep reminding myself and others that eating is not a problem. We need to eat. Again, we need to enjoy. So unlike substance abuse or smoking, right, where the treatment is sort of to quit smoking, I can't tell you to really quit it, right? Because we need it to really to live. And so here, a lot of times we're looking at how do we measure caloric intake, right? That's sort of our holy grail, right? And so, again, why? Because ultimately, there's been quite a bit of research on how we measure energy out or energy expenditure, but ultimately we want to know when people sort of overeat, right, or overconsume, and when they underconsume or undereat. Ultimately, so we can obtain sort of this energy balance, and really, again, like I said, to understand human behavior, but also to potentially intervene, right, to obtain this sort of energy balance, right? We might need to put some distance between us and the donuts. But again, here I've noticed UCLA food system, at least lunch, is pretty healthy. So kudos to them. All right, so again, measuring caloric intake is quite challenging, right? And so a lot of what we tend to do is look at a certain proxy, right, to caloric intake. And so what is the best feature out there? So there is potentially the ability to measure food ingestion using various sensor modalities like inertial proximity or image-based sensors. Now, image-based sensors have the potential to really measure several behaviors, right? There's also swallowing as well, which can be measured using acoustic, mechanical, electrical, or image-based sensors. There's also chewing, and Hayes and Jones also showed that prolonged chewing at lunch decreases later snack intake. So hopefully you guys chewed quite a bit during lunch. We'll see. You could potentially test that on yourself. But one question to constantly ask yourself when you're also thinking about the sensor that you're going to select is really what other context or physiology can be gained from the sensor that I'm actually going to be using. And so there's also heart rate variability, and so Reisenhofer showed that in young adolescent girls that increased heart rate and lower heart rate variability tended to occur or correlate with loss of control eating right before the loss of control eating episode. But again, that hasn't necessarily been validated in other populations. There's also GSR, which we know can potentially help us in estimating stress as well, the galvanic skin response or skin conductivity. That sort of arousal that happens or manifests with stress. And also, alone, whether you're eating alone or not, which tends to also occur in people with binge eating disorder. And so something to think about when selecting your sensor is also what other features, right, can actually be measured with the sensor.
I have a question. Can you maybe provide an example of what imaging would be? I guess
yeah, so like a camera, right?
Oh, okay.
And so with an image-based sensor, we're talking about a camera, and I'm actually wearing one that's sort of pointed towards my mouth to be able to capture whatever goes into my mouth. Okay. Yeah. So as you can see, imaging tends to go across the board. It can really help us in measuring a lot of these, features. So again, correlation between features and caloric intake. So how many of you are familiar with bite counter? Yeah. Hoover's bite counters. So again, he's showed that across different individuals that there is a correlation, significant correlation between the number of bites as well as caloric intake. So ultimately, the more feeding gestures, the more calories consumed. We also published showing that also duration, feeding gestures, and swallows correlate with caloric intake. And so the question is, what port or passive objective, what passive objective real-time device can actually capture some of these features? And so our first thought was to look at, and so here again, I'll be focused on these three things. One thing to really think about again is what is the construct that I'm actually trying to capture, right? Also, when we're thinking about our application needs, we need to really always be thinking about battery lifetime. Do I care that it's going to last all day long or not? And do I need to do any form of real-time processing from my actual sensor? And what the technical performance aspect helps us answer is whether it's whether it's reliable, accurate information, right, that I can get both in lab and in the wild, like from these sensors. And again, our human factors sort of really help us answer, will people wear this? And so here, these are several components that I'll be addressing as it relates to technical performance. Right, so, and I'll go through them. I'm going to leave out machine learning because I know Ben will be covering that extensively tomorrow. So I'll touch on it very briefly as I'm going through. A lot of times we do tend to focus a lot on the machine learning, right? And how accurate does the sensor predict this feature, right? That's really what we tend to ask a lot of times. And we leave out a lot of things that ultimately impact the machine learning performance, right? So let's go through this. So again, our first question is: are there research, right? Are there existing devices, right, or commercial devices out there? And so at the time when I was looking at this, sort of back in 2014, we had Oliver Amp we sort of did his Ph.D. in wearable sensors and eating detection between 2000 and 2010. Tested audio-based sensors, right, with these ear pads, right, that he would attach to the ear to actually be able to measure chewing, right, or monitor chewing. Salzanaw also looked at the piezoelectric sensor, right, which uses sort of this piezoelectric effect that ultimately measures sort of change in acceleration or strain or force and converts that into an electrical charge that we can ultimately then measure, right? And so it gives us sort of a quantifiable measure. Now, there used to be this website, Preventive, but I recently found out that it actually is down. But what was nice was it actually showed us a lot of these commercial devices that are out there that could potentially capture some of these constructs that we care about. And so the latest, when I actually captured it from this website, there were about 427 wearables, and these are the average prices. But again, there weren't really at the time, when I was looking, there wasn't really any sort of measure that could objectively capture eating-related behaviors. There's also NCI's grid-enabled measures database, which I think is great. You can search different constructs and different measures as well, and you can actually potentially rate them and sort of explain your experience with them. But again, there wasn't really sort of a sensor or an objective way of sort of measuring eating when you actually search under constructs here as well. And so another thing to think about is also prototyping platforms, right? Is the device, right, or the engineer using sort of a prototype platform, or are they actually designing their own PC? And this is a really important question. And so there are a lot of now open source electronic platforms like Arduino, right, that really sort of allow you to quickly buy and integrate sensors with these microprocessors. And so they have sort of this microprocessor, this is really here where we would implement a lot of the firmware, right, or software or logic, right, that'll actually run on our actual wearable device. It has also potential storage space, like an SD card, connection with USB, so I can immediately program it, and also an ability to interface and integrate a battery source as well. And it allows me also to test multiple sensors. There are a lot of these also open source electronic platforms now, and it really depends on what your needs are, right? There's Node MCU, there's Texas Instruments has this MSP430 that's also low power. TMZ is also fast and also quite small. So again, depending on the programming interface or how you want to program, whether you want Wi-Fi or in a cheap solution, you might use Node MCU. There are also many more. There's one that has its own operating system as well. But the reason why I bring this up is because there's also the other route of PCB design, right? That really, ultimately when we go commercial, right, a lot of these devices you end up customizing a lot of what you actually need, right? So you might not actually need this USB here, right? There are a lot of components as well that I might not necessarily need on the device, and so I can really miniaturize the device a lot more. So I can reduce the form factor by 5 or 10. So a lot of times, like the sensors that you're looking at right now, for example, are actually using a prototype platform. So before, sometimes we're so quick to judge, right? Like, oh, that's so big and bulky. But just remember that once, it does commercialize, or once, we do put in again, there's a cost factor associated with customizing your own design. Once we do put that in, it miniaturizes the sensor potentially up to a factor of 5 or 10. So keep that in mind as well when you're asking your collaborator or the engineer whether they're using a prototype platform or an actual customized piece of computing. Again, what's great here is it's sort of ideal for human factor analysis as well, right? You want it to be miniaturized, smaller. You want it to be customized because then when it comes to actually testing various human, whether people will wear it will happen, right? So always keep that in mind in terms of whether size is actually the barrier and weight of the device or not. Another really important question, right, is can you actually see the difference between what you're actually trying to measure? And a lot of times you do want to ask your computer scientist or engineer to show you what this signal looks like, right? So if you're actually trying to detect eating, or you're actually trying to detect stress, so what does the signal look like, and can I discriminate visually, right? And so using a throat mic, for example, this is a spectrogram image, right? And so this allows us, right, to have, so it's sort of a visual representation, right, of sort of the spectrum of frequency across time. And so the y-axis here shows us time, the x-axis frequency. And so here we see that there are higher frequential components in the center here, and higher components here as well, frequency components before the swallow, right, than you would potentially find here in another activity other than what a swallow actually looks like. So this is also important because it allows you to sort of really understand potentially and gives us ideas also what type of algorithm we might design surrounding the signal. I then went about and tested also a piezoelectric sensor, right? And so here, every time, which again measures that sort of vibration rate. So every time I swallow, right, I'm actually going to see increased variability in the signal. And so here, this is the raw data, and then I'm actually calculating deviation across time, and then this is sort of showing you if I actually had just a simple threshold, whether I can actually detect swallows over time. And then here's also another spectrogram image that shows the swallow and also the frequency differences if I was eating chips, for example, versus water or versus sandwich. So the idea is also, can I actually visually also see a difference? And that'll also help you believe that the sensor actually works. Right? In our early experiments, we actually had a push-button approach where every time someone actually, so this doesn't need to necessarily be like a full-blown study, right? You're just validating the sort of visual confirmation. Yeah, this sensor could potentially work. So every time someone would swallow, they'd actually just push a button, and that way I wouldn't need to use a camera, right, and have to have someone annotate later when they swallowed every time, right? Every time they swallow, they push the button, and that way I can immediately timestamp exactly when the swallow occurred. So again, in the middle of analyzing a lot of the technical performance aspects, you do want to think about the human factors, right? So you're constantly also testing and getting feedback from users. And so here we asked them, would you wear a neck-worn sensor to the group diet, and compared it to a wrist-worn device. About 88% of the 93 people said they would wear the wrist-worn sensor, but then the neck-worn, right, 41% still said never, and then yes, I might try, and then depends on the style of the device, right? So there you know that there's potential personalization, right, that might actually improve their ability or their willingness to wear the device. Some of them said it was uncomfortable on the neck, and they needed a looser necklace. And so this was actually using the piezoelectric vibration sensor that actually had to be attached, right, to actually sense sort of the vibration. And even the audio-based sensor had to actually be, choker, right, that was really attached to the skin, and it was really uncomfortable. And so we then thought, all right, what's a different potential idea that's more contactless, if you will, right? And so this idea of using a proximity sensor came into play. That was an infrared sensor potential that would be pointed towards the chin, where I can actually measure chewing, right? And so here, the top signal is the signal for proximity, and I can actually see chewing in between these bites, right? And this didn't actually need, it didn't need to be stuck or choking me around the neck. But the sensor needed to be pointed towards the chin. We also added an ambient light sensor, and what was interesting with the ambient light here at the bottom is right before each bite, right, there was sort of a dip in the ambient light, right? Also with the inertial measurement unit, we could, which is the 9-axis inertial measurement unit that Vivek was mentioning, we can actually get a lean forward angle, right? So we can get whether someone's moving forward or actually backward. And we can also get an energy calculation. So here we can sort of get an energy calculation, as well as here, every time they're about to take a bite, there's a dip in the signal, right? And so we see some sort of pattern that the machine learning algorithm could potentially learn, right? And here, I'm going to actually show a demo of the device. Push forward a little bit. Okay, and so this is one of my students here. And so what it's doing is it's actually transmitting the data from the necklace to the camera, and we see her chewing as it's counting, and every time he takes a bite, there's sort of an increase in the proximity sensor, and then we see these chewing, these periodic sequences in the proximity signal. Okay? Now, next, so again, it just loops back and overwrites the data, right? So now it's actually overwriting. Now he actually takes a phone call, right? And so we try to look at the signal to see whether that periodic sequence also occurs. And we see that yes, when there is audio, the signal does look quite different when he's actually talking. So a lot of times chewing and talking can potentially be confounders for each other with the proximity sensor. Now here is the ambient light sensor, and we see every time he takes a bite of the apple, there's sort of a dip in the ambient light, right? So he took 2 bites there, and now he'll take a 3rd bite, and as he takes another bite, there's also again that dip in ambient light, right? So again, every time your hand sort of comes into the field of view. Now here, when he leans back, right, we sort of see a lean back for drinking, and then as he leans forward, the signal goes down. As he leans back, it goes up and down as well. And next, again, there's sort of an activity sensor also that's measured here. So as he's moving, also we can tell there's greater intensity in the signal. So again, here it's not that one signal potentially is perfect, right? But hopefully, by taking sort of this multi-sensor approach, we can more accurately detect when an eating episode actually occurs. So Vivek also mentioned the importance of sample rate and sample rate reliability, right, or sort of that consistency. So for one of our sensors, we actually looked at, so this shows us sort of a heat map across 24 hours. And one thing that's really important is to make sure you know whether the sample rate is actually reliable or not, right? And so here we can actually see that data was collected from 0 to 3 hours. And this is the delta T, right? So this actually shows that I was expecting about 5 hertz, right? So 5 samples a second. So it means that between every sample, I'm expecting a delta of about 200 milliseconds, right? But I see here also there's a bit of variability. Sometimes it's 200, sometimes it's about 400 milliseconds, right? So there's a bit of variability there. But there's no data here. And so this really surprised me, right? And then here from the 10th to the 19th hour, data was actually good, right? And so here the question was, did they charge it? Was this, was this intended to actually happen or not? And so it's really important to be able to look to visually confirm. Here's sort of an example of one that's not reliable in terms of the sample rate. Here, we were expecting this sensor to provide us about 200 hertz. So we expect sort of the line to be up here, but we notice again dips in the frequency. And so even when you're programming some of your sensors on your smartphone, you do want to check to make sure you want to make sure that your sample rate is actually reliable. So here is sort of 20 hertz. It's sort of a reliable sample rate, right? So we sort of really get, and this is actually showing per second, 20 samples a second, right? And so if I was to zoom in here, you'd see it's probably jumping between 20 and 21 hertz, right, or samples per second. So here, so one important thing to consider in over here we sort of looked at a single day, but it's really important to also make sure that you're collecting that you've looked at reliability across time, right? So if your study is actually 7 days, you want to make sure that the engineers actually tested reliability over those 7 days, right? If it's longer, again, you want to make sure reliability has been tested for the duration of your study. Or at least long enough to not see degradation. And so we noticed this with one of our sensors, and it really directly influenced our firmware and how we actually, our logic behind how we program this device. And so here initially we were getting about 16.7 hertz in day 1. It was so interesting to notice here that by day 7, this looks like a small drop, but it's about, it's actually 880, which is about 14.7 hertz. There's a little bit of a drop there in 7 days, and so that really concerned me, especially if my study is going to be about 30 days, right? And so what ended up happening was this sort of told us that the way we were partitioning our file size, it was a little bit too big, so every time we would write to memory, it would be a concern. And so how often we wrote to memory needed to change. So again, this informed a change in the firmware to improve our reliability. So again, really important to make sure you ask directly, can you show me the sample rate of the sensor across X days, right? And a lot of times, sometimes engineers, they'll have a device, right, or maybe they've only tested it for a single day in a clinical setting, and that's all they care about. Whereas now, you're interested in testing this device across 30 days or 60 days, so this might be something that they didn't actually test. How does the sensor get its timestamp? This is so critical. I see some smiles in that. And so here we have acceleration X, Y, and Z, right? And so this is a Unix timestamp that can ultimately get converted into a specific, up to the millisecond in time. And so it can potentially get its time from the microprocessor, right, that's locally on board. And that'll be relative time. So every time the battery dies, it's going to start from 0. Okay? And so all you're going to be getting in that case is sort of the time that from the beginning of when the battery last died. Okay? And so it's great if your battery never dies, right? Which is probably ungood. Now, others potentially think about adding an RTC, or real-time clock, right? Do you guys want to stand up for a moment?
I stand up.
Yeah, you're going to just stand and stretch. Let's do this. I know Dr. White. And we need a bit of a stretch. Okay?
Thanks for
Yeah, you're welcome. We can thank Donna, that was sort of a cue. Yeah. All right. All right. Take your time. And so here, it's really important for us to think about adding a real-time clock. And this is really how a lot of our watches actually continue working. Where even there's a capacitor that's connected to it, so even when your battery on the device actually dies, the clock doesn't, it continues ticking. So, so this is a very important component to add as well. So taking from the X sensor here, if it senses X times a second, it'll ask every time, it'll ask the RTC every once in a while, what time is it, and it'll update, accordingly. Another approach is to transmit the data via Bluetooth to your smartphone, and then have your smartphone actually timestamp the data. There are advantages to this as well, but again, you can imagine here there are a lot of problems that can occur, especially if one sample arrives after the other, if there's a delay in the sample, right? So in terms of, or if the packet gets lost, potentially your phone is out of range, it's not within range, or your phone also dies, so you don't have data for that period of time, and that's the problem. So what parts, it's important to also think about what components of your device actually impact battery lifetime. So you want some sort of profile, right? So this shows you a profile of the necklace that I'm actually wearing right now. Again, there's the Bluetooth component. There are other factors that also consume power. There's the inertial measurement unit here that takes up about 30% of the battery lifetime. There's also the proximity and ambient light sensor that's only about 6% of the battery lifetime. And so if I wanted to optimize, I could ask myself, do I really want this IMU or not? Another question again is the SD card, right? Being able to store locally on the SD card that's on the device takes about 33% of the battery. And so this is actually the real-time clock. It takes about 1% of the time. So and it's an important piece of the component. So thinking about your needs here is really important and whether you can actually change that. And here you can also begin to think about your sampling rate and how your sample rate could potentially impact battery lifetime. And so this is published by Cross, and it shows here that as they were increasing the sample rate, it reduced their battery lifetime. Right? Now, increasing sample rate, as Vivek mentioned, can potentially help you in terms of the type of analysis that you need to do. So thinking about this also is really important as well. And whether the engineer can adjust the sample rate of the device or not. So again, thinking about your application needs and whether you can turn on or off certain sensor components. Wear time is huge, right? And so thinking about the signal and can the engineer or computer scientist actually assess when the individual is wearing the device? So for example, we did a little bit of sort of empirical analysis here from our sensor, and we showed, okay, when I'm actually wearing the sensor, this is sort of what the signal looks like, right? When it's on the table, okay, my threshold sort of works. It's still below. It's below my threshold, so I can tell, okay, it's not moving. When it's inside a backpack, it still looks like it's actually moving, right? And so if I only depended on my lean forward angle and this sort of very simple heuristic that I'm using to determine wear time, then this is not going to work. But if I combine that with my ambient light sensor, right, this could potentially work, right? So when I'm wearing it, this is sort of what the signal looks like. When I'm not wearing it, when it's on the table, it's sort of constant as the ambient light. When it's in my backpack, now the signal's really low. And so when I combine these two, I can really get at wear time. Right? So this is important to think about. Jim Ray, Susan Murphy, and Santosh published a book on mobile health, And they also look at signal, how to determine whether there's a good quality signal, right? So here they're looking at an ECG signal, and they have sort of logic to determine whether the signal is actually acceptable or unacceptable, right? And now they've gone through a whole, they have heuristics for various types of sensors. The respiration, the RIP, the respiratory plethysmography. They have one for ECG. They also have one for accelerometers, and they also have it publicly provided for you at the GitHub as well. So you can also potentially look at the logic that they use to know whether the sensor is actually being worn or whether the data is actually really usable or not, right? And you need to know when it's usable to potentially feed into the machine learning. So again, we went now with this new sensor. We did another user experience, a human factors study, and we tested it this time on people with obesity, people that are overweight and with normal BMI. And one interesting thing about the necklace that showed up was 87.5% were actually willing to wear this sensor. However, there were concerns about the Velcro. So this is actually the one that I'm actually wearing right now. There's a Velcro strap in the back, and especially with some females or even with males that have longer hair, it was a concern with the Velcro snap at the back. The size was a factor, but I knew that could potentially be addressed. Breathability was also a factor with the necklace, with the strap. And we also found problems with the time stamp. And so here we redesigned the necklace. This is sort of necklace 2.0, or actually like 7.0. So here's the new sensor. We changed the strap to add sort of breathing holes and a silicone material. Interestingly, when I actually came to the conference, I tell my students, I want to actually make sure I test the device as well. The new study that we did with the silicone strap, people actually liked it. I didn't, and so this is why I prefer the leather band. And this is why I think, again, this sort of personalization approach is going to be so critical to be able to accommodate when we're dealing with wearable sensors. Right? I sort of envision this future where people are going to be bringing the type of wearable they're willing to wear, and we sort of 3D print or customize it in lab before they sort of go out and leave. This new version, our older version, so here I'm actually wearing the new version, but the old strap. But this new version has now a real-time clock because we have a huge timestamp problem with our first iteration. So again, we did another human factors study. This was really interesting because I started to ask them without compensation how many days they're willing to wear the necklace. And this was with a silicone band and with a breathable band. And people with obesity said about, on average, 4.5 days. And people with a normal overweight BMI about 2.6 days. This is interesting, right? And I think when we're starting to think about the population that we're going to be studying, this is important too, to really find the right population for your device and sensor. When I asked them please describe sort of the monetary compensation you need to motivate you to wear the necklace for 30 days, it's so interesting to me that people with obesity had a little bit more of a reasonable response. In the career study, for my career brand, we're going to be deploying this for 30 days. This is why I came to ask about this. And so this is very reassuring to me, right? This notion that, okay, there's based on the population that I hope to study, people with obesity, there's hope that they will wear it for 30 days. Again, hope, I say, until we actually do the study. So again, here I'll briefly touch on the machine learning model approach, so I can talk a little bit about the ground truth measure, which I think is really important. So typically here you collect sensor data, you test various algorithms that then I'll probably go over tomorrow. From these algorithms, you learn a particular machine learning model. You then test that machine learning model. You have an output, and you compare it against a ground truth. Okay? Now, that ground truth can be different, right? So for stress, it could be subjective, if I cared about self-reported stress. For eating or smoking, it could be objective. So a wearable camera, right? I could visually confirm if I was to see that the person was actually smoking for a day. And so again, before now looking at the machine learning model that's built, it's really critical to look at what type of ground truth measure we use. So we went ahead and designed this new camera. Actually, we took a commercial off-the-shelf camera, this hidden camera that you can buy on Amazon for about $100. And we added a fisheye lens to it. We also added a LED flashlight to it. It had a shoulder strap and it had an ID cover so that it would sort of obfuscate the lens a little bit. And we also designed a 3D camera case as well around it. And again, we were trying to sort of use the fisheye lens so that I can actually capture the feeding gesture, what's going in the mouth, and it was pointed towards the dominant hand. And I wanted a fisheye lens so I can actually capture a larger field of view to sort of see the plate and what's around the person. And every sort of 5 minutes, I'd have this LED light that would flash, and this was actually sent from the smartphone. If the smartphone was in proximity, this was before we built our real-time clock. Before we used our the RTC, I used this LED approach, which actually did not work again. So this was another lesson learned with the LED flashing. They also didn't like that something was flashing every 5 minutes. It was a bit disturbing, as you can imagine. So again, to test the collection of the ground truth camera, this was sort of what we could see. And so here's a person, they're actually talking to a bystander, this is the wearer, there's another bystander, and so we could actually see roughly, we can see the bites and we can actually see potentially what they're eating. Now, when I combine this with 24-hour dietary recall, right, I can get at greater accuracy, right, of the meals. I can see what was missed by the dietitian, right, and also what was missed by the camera potentially, right? Combining these two sources was very so again, rigor in labeling ground truth is really important. And so here we use Elon, developed in Europe. It's an open source. It's available online. You can actually use. Actually, I'm not sure if it's open source or not, but it's actually available for use, and you can actually. So it's really important to decide on. Make sure there's rigor in your labeling technique. And here, the user of Elon's actually labeling your key episodes. Okay, time synchronization across multiple devices. This is important. So here are video labels, and here's the signal. And there's sort of an offset in time, right? Because I labeled the video, right? And now this is the inertial measurement unit signal, my accelerometer. Right? There's AXY, AXZ, and AX accelerometer X as well. And so with Elon, what you can potentially do is offset the timestamp visually, right, to correct for it. So this is something that's really important to think about. How do I synchronize across devices? A really important question to be asking. You can ignore this before your study, but it'll really bite you in the ass, right, when you're sort of analyzing your data, because you're going to need to manually do this for all your data, which is a huge burden. Or you might sort of look at machine learning approaches to do this, but again, those are also extremely challenging. So again, thinking about a single device that synchronizes the clocks on all devices once a day or week. Right, so even with the RTC, there will still be a little bit of a drift. So you do want every once in a while to, so what we do now in the morning, every time I turn on the sensor and the phone is in close proximity, it actually updates all my devices, all the clocks on my devices, so now they're all synchronized. Right? Again, and so there's the machine learning pipeline and looking at accuracy. Here, looking at whether the model is personalized, generalized, or sort of a generalized algorithm that becomes sort of more personalized. I'm sure Ben will cover this. One of the bioethical concerns that we had with the camera was this notion of bystander privacy as well, right? So you guys are all sitting here, and I have a camera, so there's a concern, right? Why are you being recorded? And so we came up with this new idea that combines an IR sensor array with an RGB camera so that we can actually know when the hand is in close proximity, and so it can obfuscate the background. So all I see is what actually goes into the mouth. And so now I can generate this video, right, that masks or blurs the background. Maybe I can blur the background as opposed to masking it completely. But this way I protect sort of my bystanders or anything that's sort of far away into the earth. We're soon going to be testing all these sensors and these devices in a study with 60 people that have obesity. And ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand problematic eating phenotypes and how they co-occur with each other. Right? So how a lot of these features like feeding gesture, chewing rate, stress, how all these factors co-occur with each other. And some of the psychological factors we actually capture using a smartphone, so using imaging. Because of time, I'm going to quickly go through the stress project, just a few things with regards to the stress sensor. So here, we're looking at actually stress, and because there's this notion of stress impacting the neurodevelopment during pregnancy, stress during pregnancy impacts the neurodevelopment of the child. And so being able to detect the total number of minutes of stress in a day is really important, and how that potentially relates, and how that potentially impacts the neurodevelopment of the child is critical. And so we needed to build a model to detect stress, right, or high stressful days, so that we can ultimately intervene in time, right, sort of send a mind-body mindfulness intervention to reduce stress. There were two competing sensors that we looked at: the E4 sensor, which was the wrist-worn sensor that's designed by MIT, Picard Empatica sensor, which is right here, and this biostamp. And what's nice about this biostamp is it's sort of hidden, right? It's a flexible worn sensor. I apply this adhesive every morning. There's a new adhesive. I stick it on, and no one sees that I'm actually wearing the sensor. I was surprised because with wrist-worn sensors, I'm always used to sort of it being, showing sort of higher acceptance than other sensors. But I found that a lot of people preferred using the biostamp over the E4. And again, the E4 is a bit bulky, so again, keep that in mind. I'm not comparing it to an LG watch, for example, or an Apple Watch. But it was very bulky, and it got in the way with typing and usability, and so a lot of people didn't necessarily like it. And so we actually ended up going with the biostamp. And when we asked the company, MC10 that designed it, they ultimately told us that they tested it in clinic. Most of the tests that they actually performed were no more than a day. And here we are testing it on pregnant women for 12 weeks, right? And so this is something to think about. We also built a model around noise, because again, you can imagine with this a new type of issue arises. Again, a noisy signal can occur when you're stretching, right? And so we designed a study and we actually tested it on some photos, a picture with the cubs. Because you can imagine there's a lot of stretching, right, with the picture. And so here, we didn't really need for this to actually test it on pregnant women. So this was published actually at the Body Sensor Network, not this year, but last year. So one thing to think about, again, I'm going to jump a little bit here, but is how so one thing I wanted to just address was, are we predicting self-reported stress or physiological stress? And if it's self-reported stress, then our ground truth can be EMA or ecological monitoring system. Otherwise, we're going to resort to sort of stress induction or inducing stress in the lab, using various techniques like the Trier social stress test, cold pressor, infant crying, and other mechanisms. So because we didn't test this, we didn't want to start our study until we actually tested it for about 12 weeks. So we did a pre-pilot for 12 weeks, which was done on 15 pregnant women. And we had them wearing it. Again, a lot of issues with the device. And it was very important to ask, is there company buy-in? And will the company fix the problems or bugs? And what ended up happening was we saw high variability in participants' adherence to the sensor technology, right, which we would expect. And so we modified our algorithm to not only be physiologically, based on the physiological stress, but to also combine self-reported and sensor data. And so our model ultimately, before it triggers, I'll just say this, before it triggers, we look at self-report and physiology before we trigger intervention. I'm going to jump, this other project, we also combine self-report and sensor data. It's about UV exposure and sun exposure in melanoma survivors. So you can talk to me about that if you have questions. I'm running out of time. So I just want to summarize here. When it comes to selecting the sensor, you really want to think about, again, constructs, battery lifetime, real-time processing. The research commercial, is there existing devices out there? Are they using prototype board or PCB custom design? You want it visually confirmed. You want to look at signal reliability. Again, validity of your measure, right? Are you actually measuring what you intend to measure? Again, how accurate your machine learning model is. And ultimately, a lot of this can potentially be handled by the machine learning algorithm if there are problems here. But that's just a high load, right? I mean, if you've got all these issues, try to address them, right? So you can try to learn, the actual good quality signal, as opposed to dealing with these other issues that, given time, can actually be mitigated, right? And then if you have multiple of those devices, how do you deal with time synchronization? These are just one of my favorite quotes from Leo Reiman, where he says the best solution could be an algorithmic model or a data model, or maybe a combination, but the trick to being a scientist is to be open to using a wide variety of tools. And I think this is really important. A lot of times, when we're thinking about sensors, self-report measures, it doesn't have to be just one, right? When you're thinking about a lot of your projects, combining them can potentially be also very informative. And thank you. Do we have time for questions? Or,
What funding usually pays for device development?
What funding pays for device development? So a lot of National Science Foundation funds, NSF pays for novelty in device development. There are also mechanisms at NIH that also pay for it as well. I see some nodding in the back. So there are some that I'm familiar with at NIDDK as well. There are R21s that are dedicated for sort of, there are high risk, high reward Do you have others that you
Yeah,
want to
I mean,
add?
so there are many mechanisms that could be used to fund device development. And one thing to think about is looking at any kind of measurement-focused funding opportunity announcement you can definitely use for device development as well. They'll have varying requirements about how far along you need to be in order to commit.
This is really an eye-opening, lecture for us, because we never know so much science behind the tiny sensor. So my question is for you and also for Vivek, like how do we balance in terms of the choice of the sensor or wearable devices? Commercially available ones, or should we knock our engineering colleagues door and say, hey, develop a new one for us?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I don't know if
Go ahead.
So, I always say right away, right, that if always look for existing devices out there. Your engineering colleague also does not want to redesign the wheel, right? So if there is an existing device out there, there's no novelty in developing it ever again. So always do look at what exists out there. But at the same time, there is benefit in collaborating with an engineer or faculty at UCS. But you have to also understand that there's a process, right, and understand that they have also interests as well. A lot of these problems that came up were problems, but they were opportunities for me as well, right? Because I can now design either a novel sensor or a novel framework or sort of a new algorithm, right, surrounding that problem, right? So what might be a problem to you, for me, is sort of like a research opportunity. So there's really great potential synergy there, but there has to be really a lot of patience, I think. And again, knowing the right, what questions, the right questions to ask.
I will just add to that. This is a theme that Donna and Ben will emphasize. Engineers are interested in solving wicked problems. Not interested in developing technologies you can use when there is no novelty with it. But you do need engineering friends because they will help you translate and think through your problem. With manufacturers, there are challenges, but they can productize these things. Something that takes a long time. Even a simple thing like a band is not easily made if it's on a one-off basis. So companies are better at productizing these, rapid prototyping, and depending on the company that you go with. But on the other hand, they will lock you into their proprietary algorithms and not give you their raw data. So it's a trade-off. So, but it's best to invest your time and resources feeding your engineering colleague. Did I say it wrong?
No.
Yeah.
I'll use that. Let me just add that it's not an either-or situation. Even if you're going to use off-the-shelf devices, if you want to knit them together in a new way, you're going to need engineering help. Now, sometimes what I've learned is that engineers and computer scientists, they're not service animals. They're not here to service us. They're here to do their own science. So what you need to know, I feel like, is that, where are the interesting problems for the engineering team, and where do we need to hire a programmer, right? So off the shelf doesn't mean off your back necessarily. There can still be a lot of programming involved, but that might not necessarily be programming for an academic engineer. Or maybe you have academic engineers in the line for, in the mix until the problems get solved, and then you hire a programmer to sort of babysit the rest of the intervention.
Yeah, and also with companies, there are potential problems there as well, again, right? So they're not used to doing, it depends on, again, their experience in doing research studies, how well they test it, right?
How much access you get to your data.
Right, yeah, so, and also company buy-in is really important to make sure they're willing to optimize their device, right? So if they're just there to tell you take it as is, you gotta be careful with that, right? And again, because they might disappear in a couple of years, like Ambient.
They really
let's take a couple more questions, then we have to roll into our team science.
Hopefully what is a quick one, but we'll see. You talked about, I really liked the part of your presentation where you talked about checking the data and visualizing it with your team. When you're talking about the sampling rate changing over time, I was like, oh my gosh, it changes. And you mentioned that by looking at that, you were able to figure out there was something wrong with the sensor. Is there like a short list, or is there like what influences sampling rate when you built a sensor to be sampling at a constant rate? Like, why does that happen?
Yeah, well, so again, it all goes back to whether it's built also on a prototype board, how often it's tested, right? Is it sort of in the alpha, beta testing phase? Initially, ideally, ultimately, you get to the point once it's been rigorously tested where sample rate is fairly consistent and reliable, and that's ideally the goal. Again, when we're developing, when you also have students developing as well, certain things need to be optimized. Some boards also are not optimized in the way that they should be as well. So this is why I always recommend rigorous testing behind sample rate. I mean, eventually, after several iterations of testing, you should get to the point where it is market.
Okay, then we'll, you have no questions?
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Actually,
Sorry.
so this is very interesting.
Okay, go ahead. I also have a quick response to that. So the sensor is sensing constantly at a constant rate. Sometimes the microprocessor, the logic behind you going to grab the data, because there's competing resources. So it's doing so many things. That firmware, that software that we built, it's doing so many things. So it doesn't catch up. So you're optimal. So you need to improve how you're actually coding on the firmware. Right. So it's not that it's not sensing at that rate. It is. It's your ability to grab it at the right time that's effective. You need to optimize the code.
That's really helpful.
Yeah.
So what was the inclusion or gestational age of the pregnant participants? And the second question is, how did you, discuss or address protection of vulnerable populations such as pregnant women?
That's such a great question. So, IRB took forever. So it's been 2 years, and now we're launching the 7th. So it's actually launched last week. We had 200 pregnant women. So we're excited, and it took 2 years to get to this point. Okay, so again, a lot of back and forth with IRB. The pregnant women are in their second trimester, so once sort of they're at that stable point in their pregnancy, that's when we begin to recruit them, and we apply intervention for about 12 months. But yeah, it's very challenging. Actually, we did apply for a grant in STTR that had a good score, but it was contingent on us finishing the IRB. And still it took forever for us to get IRB, and now we actually submit. So just, it's an issue, but we did get IRB. So.
We will have Camille Leviker who will come to us with tools, practical tools there and working on it. It's a big issue. And,
She's never assistant.
Yeah. Perfect. So back to the trenches.